Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started as the last few people walk in. Thank you all very much for coming, and welcome to the first session of the fall series of our HNRCA. And we could have not started the series with a more appropriate person. I am delighted to have Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian as the first speaker of the seminar series this fall. He is, as all of you know, the new dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition and brings a lot of excitement and energy to the school and to Tufts Nutrition. So we are delighted to have him here as a speaker. Dariush does not need an introduction for most of you, I know, but I'm going to just give you a few words about his background for the few of you who might not know him already. Dariush is a cardiologist and epidemiologist with research focus on global diet and cardiometabolic health and dietary policy, and he has been telling us that this is why he's been interested in coming to Friedman, because it does give him an opportunity to impact further policy decisions and use his background and expertise in that regard. He has more than 200 scientific publications, mostly focused on cardiometabolic diseases and lifestyle, and the impact of lifestyle on cardiovascular and health. He has a specific interest in entry fatty acid, global dietary burden of diseases, trans fatty acid, diets and weight gain, and healthy dietary patterns. And he's served on many different committees, including the American Heart Association and World Health Organization. He received his BS in biological sciences from Stanford, and then an MD from Columbia, an MPH from University of Washington, and a doctorate in epidemiology from Harvard. So he has a very good pedigree, I would say. He is a board certified in cardiovascular medicine, and until serving as the dean was actually a practicing physician, and I know that he plans to go back and at least do some clinic when he gets a chance. Some of you know that Dariush does not shy away from controversy, so not only I'm looking forward to his presentation, but I'm also looking forward to a lively dialogue after his presentation. So with that, please welcome Dr. Mozaffarian.
So thank you very much, and it's so unusual to be introduced with my name pronounced correctly. So that's very unusual. Thank you, Simin, for that. So it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, a privilege to be here. You know, the HNRCA is so important for Tufts Nutrition, and you know, HNRCA scientists, both those that are Friedman faculty and those that are not, are really doing wonderful research and moving forward, and I really look forward to partnering on that agenda. I was at USDA on Tuesday, and I met with, I can't remember her last name now, but one of the administrators who oversees all of the USDA centers, and she made a point to say that this is their flagship center that they're most proud of, and so you probably already know that, but if you don't know that, you know that USDA thinks very highly of this center, as it should. So it's really a privilege to speak here, and so I'm going to talk about sort of my perspectives on the science and where the science is moving in terms of dietary priorities for preventing obesity. And it's an interesting question: are all calories created equal for obesity? I think that most people sort of deep down might just implicitly say, well, probably not. I mean, if you have 100 calories from broccoli, could it really be the same as having 100 calories from soda? But once you say that, like, it sort of makes sense that they probably shouldn't be equal. But then if you really start going down the line, the natural path of all of the things we're doing in terms of our food labeling, our policies, our guidelines, even our science, our trials, we really do treat all calories as being created equal. And I think the science is suggesting that's a mistake. So let me see if I can convince you of that. And I guess there may be a few people watching from Grafton or Medford, so welcome as well. So this is something that I showed when I spoke at Friedman a couple of weeks ago. Just if you haven't seen this, this is a really nice paper. We contributed all of the dietary data to this paper. This tried to look at comparably all the different risk factors for mortality in the United States, from occupational risks to accidents to air pollution, alcohol use, drug abuse, and violence, and so forth. And what's really quite amazing is diet is now the single leading modifiable cause of poor health in the country. This is also true globally, exceeding tobacco smoking and alcohol combined, actually. So this is what we're doing is really the most important thing for health in terms of diet and health. So I think this is really quite sobering and quite amazing. And I think the gap between the scope of the problem and what we're actually doing about it is larger for diet than for anything else. So if you look down that list, we have a pretty robust agenda for tobacco smoking, high blood pressure. We're doing a lot for obesity. Diet is not just about obesity and so on. But really the gap between what we can do and how much of a benefit can be had from that is, I think, larger than for anything else on the planet, which is really exciting and a great time to be in nutrition. So this is how I would draw up the conventional wisdom about obesity. And if you look at the design of trials, if you look at our dietary guidelines, if you look at several of our policies, this is basically the theory. It's energy in, energy out, and that's what you have to really worry about. It's just portion size and calorie control and count your calories, because that's really all that matters in the end. And then, of course, obesity is the major risk factor for type 2 diabetes. And, of course, there is some truth to this thermodynamically. It is true that ultimately calories are calories, but the question is, the complex human organism, is it really just this sort of counting of calories that's so simple? Over the years, if people had to say, well, within calories, then are there any priorities at all, or are they all the same? There are some scientists who would say they're all the same, but I think this is at least the conventional wisdom that what drives calories in has been total fat. That's been the focus for decades. And if anything, based on some animal experiments and in vitro studies, any focus for diabetes, the major focus had been, although the ADA recommendations were just revised, I reviewed those recommendations, and the ADA recommendations are actually much better now. But until this last year, the ADA recommendations were basically low-fat, low-saturated fat diets. Those were basically the focus. It's fat and saturated fat. And if anything else was focused upon, it was energy density, and energy density is basically code for fat. There's other ways to change energy density, but basically it's code for fat. So it's basically about low-fat, low-saturated fat. And I think the new kid on the block is added sugars. This is where all the focus is now. Well, maybe it's really just all the added sugars, or somebody could say fructose is sort of where the conventional wisdom is what's driving the obesity epidemic. So I think this is a remarkably simplistic view of obesity, and I think the physiology and the science of the human organism and its response to foods is showing us that this is amazingly simplistic. And what this reminds me of is sort of diet and cardiovascular health from 30 or 40 years ago was very, very simplistic. And even sort of thinking about heart attacks and the physiology was very simplistic. So 40 years ago, people thought that heart attacks happened because of slow buildup of atherosclerotic plaque, and that slow buildup over time clogged the arteries. It's just a plumbing problem. Just there's plaque and there's flow, and it's basically just grease buildup, and it leads to this quote that I read all the time in the news: artery clogging fat. I really that term drives me nuts, because there's no such thing as fat going around in the arteries and clogging them up. It's this picture of like a plumbing drain, and it's just all physical. We've learned over time now that a plaque occlusion or a coronary occlusion and myocardial infarction is an unbelievably complex dynamic process. There's, of course, development of plaque over time, but it's due to many, many risk factors. There's plaque stability, plaque rupture, acute thrombosis, arrhythmic risk, matrix metalloproteinases, fibroblasts coming in and out of the artery, the thickness of the fibrous cap over the plaque, all of these things that are unbelievably interesting and complicated, and it's not just this sort of plumbing problem, right? It's just, flow in and flow out. Well, I feel like obesity, our approach to diet and obesity is sort of where our approach to MI was, to myocardial infarction was about 20 or 30 years ago. It's just all, simple physics, just calories in, calories out. I think it's much more interesting and complicated than that. And if you don't believe me that this is the focus, just look at some of the major funded trials that are done by very smart, very well-intentioned scientists. This is the Look Ahead trial. You could look at a range of major trials that have been done for weight loss for various metabolic benefits. This is the look-ahead trial. This is what they did. They had an intensive lifestyle intervention aimed at achieving and maintaining weight loss of at least 7% by focusing on reduced calories and increased activity. That was the focus, reducing calories and increasing activity. And of the dietary details, the main details were maximum 30% calories from fat and a maximum 10% calories from saturated fat. So this is the focus of how to achieve weight loss. It's to focus on calories and fat. And if you look at U.S. policy, the U.S. policy is also remarkably dominated by this idea of calories. And so just throughout the U.S. dietary guidelines, everywhere in the U.S. dietary guidelines, it talks about portion sizes, calorie control, choosing lean meats, low-fat choices, low-fat dairy, all basically code or explicitly calories or fat. The Affordable Care Act didn't really have anything in it to reduce healthcare costs or prevention, I don't think. It's really a financing act. And there's good for it being a financing act, but it's not really a public health act, except it did have one kind of public health, major public health piece in it was calorie labeling. So as you probably know, now it's national law for all chain restaurants in the United States to have total calories on the menu label. Well, what's the explicit message? What's the implicit scientific understanding is that you can look at 2 or 3 or 4 items on a menu board and choose among them based on the calories, right? Without that gives you useful information about the obesogenicity or other health effects of those calories. The U.S. FDA, have people heard about the new USDA food label? Right, it's going to have much bigger calories on it, and they're going to change the portion sizes to really reflect what people are eating. And so that's one of the major change. They're also adding added sugars, but the major change is this focus on calories to again give the idea that, well, you can tell something about the food and its healthfulness and whether it'll lead to obesity based on its calories. The National School Lunch Program had many wonderful changes in the last revision last year, but one of the changes that I don't think is evidence-based at all is they banned whole milk but allow chocolate skim milk, right? On face value, to me, it's insane, right? That you would let kids drink sugar-sweetened chocolate skim milk but not let them drink whole milk. But again, it's a focus mostly on calories and fat. And the NIH Dietary Guidelines, I'll show you this. The NIH Dietary Guidelines has this program, again, with very smart, well-intentioned scientists who are recommending, I think, pretty absurd things to families, which we'll show you based on basically total calories. So the wonderful thing about being in nutrition for the scientists who are just joining it is I've been interested in nutrition for about 20 years since being in medical school, and the advances in the science have really been quite incredible over the last 20 years. And even the last 5 or 10 years, the advances have been incredible. So I was asked to write a chapter for a book. I don't write too many chapters, and if you're a student and your faculty mentors ask you to write a chapter, usually you should say no. It's a lot of work. But I wrote one nutrition chapter, and one of the requirements was you could only have references in the last 5 years. We really want to be up to date. We want to have this be sort of cutting edge knowledge, and you can have a few kind of historic references. And I said, how am I possibly going to write a chapter on nutrition with references only in the last 5 years? That's impossible. So many of the great studies are these, it was actually unbelievably easy. I mean, once I really started looking, all of the key science, the meta-analyses, the major studies could be summarized. Of course, they built upon all of the older studies, but really in the last 5 years, there's been this explosion, I think, of knowledge in nutritional science, last 10 years in particular. There's been this explosion of knowledge building on all of the science before, and we've really progressed. And I think with that progression, we now can give pretty clear guidance on about half of what we need to know for cardiovascular disease. I think we're about halfway there for cardiovascular disease. I would say roughly maybe we're a quarter of the way or a third of the way there for obesity. We still have a long way to go. But those are big advances, I think, from 20 years ago, where mostly we were kind of guessing because we didn't have great evidence. And so I think this is something, as you talk to people say, well, nutrition science changes, and you guys said something 10 years ago and you're saying something now. You should tell them, yeah, nutrition science has changed. That's great. All science changes, and you should be happy. Just like you don't go to your doctor and ask for the best drug from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or you don't go to fly a rocket to the moon and say, give me the best technology from a decade ago or 20 years ago. You want the current science now. Same thing in nutrition science. And nutrition science has advanced considerably. So this is kind of a replacement cartoon, which obviously needs a lot of work, because as I said, I think we've only figured out maybe 25 or 30% of this so far. But certainly, of course, energy in and energy out leads to adiposity and type 2 diabetes. But rather than thinking about fat or saturated fat or energy density or even added sugars, we have to think about a lot more interesting things that affect energy in. So I think carbohydrate quality, which I'll talk about, is one of the biggest things. Intakes of whole foods and how whole foods affect energy in. Specific fats and oils, and really largely trans fats, and overall dietary patterns. Those are probably the major drivers, I think, of energy in. But what's really quite important is for metabolic health, because after all, one of the major reasons we're concerned about obesity is not being overweight itself, but because of its metabolic effects. There's enormous evidence, very, very convincing evidence that independently of your weight, independently of your BMI, diet has enormous influences on your metabolic health. And that's very important for people to realize. So there's also this direct pathway. What's quite interesting, and I think also now to me convincing, is that there's evidence from animal experiments and increasingly human trials that the type of diet you eat, the diet composition, the diet quality also influences adiposity. So calorie for calorie, it determines whether you're going to get subcutaneous adipose tissue or visceral adipose tissue, which are metabolically different in terms of their harms. And so I think the drivers of visceral adiposity, diet composition drives visceral adiposity differently than just overall weight and overall adiposity. And what's most interesting and maybe newest is there's been at least 2 human trials that are both relatively short term, about a month, and I'll show you one of these, that show that actually diet composition, diet quality affects energy out. So I think that's like one of the most amazing discoveries of the last 5 years or so, and this needs to be confirmed with longer term studies if this happens long term, but that what you eat actually affects your calories out. So it's so much more complicated than just counting your calories. You have to think about what you're eating to understand the risk of obesity. And I'll just show you some of the evidence that's accumulated over time in terms of weight loss to start, but really my talk is about preventing weight gain, not weight loss. But I'll just show you some of the evidence. Many people are very familiar with these studies. There's been many trials now looking at different weight loss diets. These take people who are overweight or obese, who have failed weight loss efforts themselves, and are eager to get on a diet to try weight loss. And so this is one example. There have been few trials over 1 year. There's only been a few out to 2 years, and none have reported past 2 years, other than Look Ahead, which wasn't just a weight loss trial, and it wasn't just a dietary trial. And so here's one example of a very good 2-year trial, just focused on diets, no changes in physical activity, looking at different types of diets, low-fat diet, Mediterranean diet, and an Atkins-style low-carbohydrate diet. And this is the change in weight over time. You can see all the diets do well in the first 6 months. First, everybody gets motivated, and whatever you do for 6 months, if you get motivated and get in a program, you'll lose weight. That's why all these fad diet books work, right? Because whatever fad diet book you read, if you read it and do what it says, over 6 months you'll lose weight because you're paying attention to your diet. But long term, what happens is people gain weight, but in most of these trials, they actually are lighter than when they started, which is a success. But here's the 2-year results for different levels of fat intake, and what's mostly seen in the longer term follow-up of these trials is they do about the same, or if anything, the higher fat diet does a little bit better. So certainly there's no evidence that a low-fat diet is superior to a high-fat diet for weight loss. And there's been a meta-analysis. This wasn't of all of the trials, but this was a meta-analysis of the ones that use sort of named diets. It's a little bit of a complicated slide, so I'll show you some of the details. So this was a meta-analysis for 48 trials, all short-term, all up to 1 year trials of weight loss diet, all in overweight or obese subjects. And basically what they show you is, compared to no diet, what's the 12-month weight loss across these different diets. The Learn diet, kind of a moderate macronutrient diet, which is really, it could be anything, just the macronutrients are sort of like the US average. Low carb, which is really high fat, or low fat diet. And what they found is, on average at 12 months, you have similar weight loss in these trials, about 7 kilograms, whether you're on a low fat or whether you're on a low carb diet. And so I think what this tells you is that the total amount of fat or the total amount of carb for short-term weight loss doesn't make a big difference. And I think this is, again, consistent with what most of these trials have seen individually, is that when you tell people to cut their calories, they do well if they change their diets for short term. What is interesting about this, though, is this isn't entirely a fair comparison. And so if you know these data well, you'll know that what's unique about the Atkins diet. Has anybody read the Atkins book or read that? What's unique about the Atkins diet in terms of its calorie recommendation? What's that? Yeah. What does anybody know? What's unique about the Atkins diet? What does it say about calories? Right? It tells you to ignore there's no calorie focus, right? So it's just a diet composition change. So what about these trials where they put people on low-fat diets or the Learn diet? There's extensive calorie information in addition, right? So this isn't actually really a fair comparison. You're comparing a diet, a higher fat diet without calorie guidance, to diets where you're really doing two things. All of these trials, basically the other arms, they were doing two things. They were telling them to cut their calories and giving them lots of portion size and calorie information, which in the short term will work. Absolutely, it'll work in the short term to lower your caloric intake versus that. So just to remember that the diets do the same, but one of them actually doesn't have any calorie guidance. And in this light, there's been just one trial, and we need more studies, but this was a nice trial recently published that got a lot of press attention. What was really interesting about this trial is, to my knowledge, this is the largest and longest term trial. It's 150 people in 1 year, but that's still the largest and longest term trial, which put obese people and overweight people on a low-fat or a low-carb diet and didn't give them calorie advice. They really just focused on changing the diet composition to say what happens in real life, because it's hard to cut your calories and count your calories and look at your portion sizes. Just change your diet composition, really low fat or really low carb. And when you do that in this trial, in any case, the low fat diet group, the low fat diet group did what's been seen in almost any dietary intervention you do. They lose weight initially and then it goes back with a pretty modest weight loss. But the low-carb diet, which again is mostly a high-fat diet with some higher protein, they actually lose weight substantially more. And what's interesting, if you look at change in fat mass, even though the low-fat diet lost weight, they actually don't lose relative fat mass at all. So they're equally losing fat and muscle. Whereas the group on the low-carb diet actually loses relative fat mass in relation to lean mass. And I think this actually goes along with carbohydrate driving de novo lipogenesis in the liver, and when you go on a low-fat diet, you actually drive de novo lipogenesis in the liver. But this is at least the first trial that I'm aware of. If you don't add the calories in, low-fat diets do worse than low-carb diets. What about total fat and incident diabetes? As I mentioned, independent of weight, fat has been promoted as a risk factor for diabetes. There's many large prospective cohort studies. I won't show you all of the data showing that there's no association between total fat intake and diabetes risk. And here we fortunately have a very nice, very large randomized trial which basically confirms the cohort studies, the Women's Health Initiative. About 50,000 women were randomized to a low-fat diet. They didn't reach their target. They were supposed to get down to 20% energy, which I think is very difficult to do in the U.S., but they got substantially down from 38% energy to 24% at 1 year and to 29% at 6 years. So that's still a large reduction in total fat, and no effect at all on incidence of diabetes and no effect at all on home insulin resistance. So the trial confirming what the cohort studies show, that total fat doesn't influence diabetes. What about saturated fat and diabetes? There's only been 5 cohorts that had reported on this a few years ago. It would be interesting to update this meta-analysis, but based on those 5 cohorts, you can see flat down the line, no cohort showed any association between high saturated fat intake versus low saturated fat intake and incidence of diabetes. And here we have the Women's Health Initiative, which in addition to cutting fat, cut saturated fat as part of cutting fat. So saturated fat went down from about 12.5% energy to about 9% energy. So that's again a pretty big reduction in saturated fat and no effect at all on reducing incidence of diabetes in the Women's Health Initiative. So saturated fat doesn't seem to be a big deal either. So all the data that I've showed you so far in terms of the weight loss trials, which is where most of the science and trials have focused, is actually talking about weight loss, right? It's talking about taking people who are already overweight and obese, who have failed weight loss efforts on their own and are coming to you for help and trying to lose weight in a pretty short amount of time. And again, if I use the cardiology analogy, this is sort of where cardiology was 30 or 40 years ago. People came into the heart attack. You said, how do we save their life? How do we treat them? It's an important question, right? That's called secondary prevention. I think what's really interesting and where we need to move, just like we've moved for cardiology or trying to move for cardiology toward primary prevention, is we need to move towards primary prevention of weight gain. I think that's really the future. It's very hard to treat obesity once it's happened. How do we prevent it? So what do we need to know to try to understand how to prevent weight gain, which is a different question than weight loss? Well, the average American gains about, the average non-obese American gains about 1 pound per year. Okay, so that doesn't really sound like a lot, but that adds up. So you think of your weight when you're 18 and you graduate high school. 20 years later, you look down and say, wow, I've gained 20 pounds. Like, how did that happen? But it's incredibly subtle, right? This is a very small effect. And so this pace makes it really, really hard for people, for any individual, to know what's driving that, right? What's driving that 1 pound a year? And it makes it very hard to study in a controlled trial. So I don't know if Jerry Dalal has taken his leave or if he's still in the audience, but I would love for him to do the power calculation of a randomized trial to detect a 1 pound a year difference over time between the groups. I mean, you need an enormous number of subjects, perfectly controlled. Oh, there you go. There he is. Large. So perfect. Okay. So large sample size. That's correct. So this is really, it would be impossible to study, or very, very challenging to study, especially if you want to study multiple determinants. And all of the data that I've shown you and the data we usually focus on, which is short-term weight loss, is pretty unlikely, I think, to inform the causes of weight gain. And that's really what we want to study. But before I move on to some evidence in that regard, I think it's really important to think back to this 1 pound per year, right? We hear a lot and people write a lot about the toxic food environment and how we're all, not we, but the Americans are all lazy and can't control themselves, and there's all this marketing and it's craziness and binging. Even with all that, we're gaining about 1 pound a year, right? So somebody do the math in terms of how many ounces that is per day. We're actually compensating amazingly well, right? Our bodies, with all the stuff around us and all the availability of food, we compensate amazingly well. And so I think it'd be really interesting to do a study, in a large population and get their daily calorie intake every day for a month and see how much it varies. It varies dramatically. And this has been done in trials where they've overfed people. They overfeed them acutely for a day, or they overfeed them for a week, or they overfeed them for 2 weeks. And what happens when they take away the overfeeding? People probably know these studies. They undereat, right? They undereat and get back to their baseline weight. So we compensate, right? We go to that Thanksgiving dinner and we have a huge amount of food. We go to a sports event and we have this massive meal. We go to most restaurants and have a huge serving size, right? If we did that every day, we'd gain 1 pound a week or 1 pound a month, but we don't. So we compensate amazingly well. And so what's really interesting to me, I think where the science is going, is what's disturbing that amazingly good compensation system that we have. We have a remarkably good compensation system. So what are the drivers? What are the drivers that are turning that off? The other reason we know we compensate amazingly well is, I won't ask for the show of hands, but how many people know somebody who's tried to lose weight, in the last year? Right? So, on average, if you ask, something like 70% of Americans at any time are trying to lose weight, which is good because 70% are overweight or obese, but it's probably not the same 70%. But it's everybody's trying, right? So if it was so easy, if it was so simple to just cut out something from your day, If you cut out 50 calories or 100 calories, you should just lose weight, right? It should melt away. But it's very difficult because we compensate. So if you have that low-fat, dairy option, instead of the whole-fat dairy option, you might have 100 or 150 less calories. You'd say, well, great, I should lose weight now. But you don't, because you make up that 150 calories elsewhere during your day. So I think that's where the science is going, really, to understand what are the drivers of this compensation, which leads me to the answer that not all calories are created equal for that compensation. So to study the question of long-term weight gain, this was work that I did when I was at Harvard School of Public Health. We looked in 3 large prospective cohort studies of men and women: the Nurses' Health Study, which is mostly older women; the Health Professional Study, which is middle-aged men; and the Nurses' Health Study 2, which is mostly younger women. And the advantage of these cohorts is they have repeated measures of diet, so we could look at change in diet. Because if you look at baseline diet, if you look at what somebody's doing now, your weight, you're already in equilibrium. Whatever you're doing now, your weight trajectory is pretty much fixed. So to change that weight trajectory, you have to change something. And this has been modeled, and most of it happens within 6 months, and probably the rest of it happens within a year. If you do something, if you make a lifestyle change to your activity or your diet or your calories, it'll change your weight for a few months, most of it out to 6 months, and if you don't make any more changes, you'll stabilize again, right? You're not going to keep melting off forever or gaining weight forever. So there's an equilibrium that happens, and so you really need to look observationally at change of diet, not baseline diet. How do we know this? Have people seen any reports of diet soda, baseline diet soda intake and change in diet over time? There's been a few papers that have looked at this. Yeah, so what do those show? If you look observationally at people who drink more diet soda and weight change. You don't lose weight, and actually they gain weight. Usually people who are drinking more diet soda gain weight. And that's probably because they've already switched, right, from caloric soda because they were worried about their weight gain, and so their current diet reflects their trajectory. So what's important here, again, we're looking at change in diet and change in weight simultaneously. And we looked at diet, we looked at physical activity, we looked at smoking, we looked at TV watching, we looked at sleep. I'm just going to focus on the diet results, and these are the main results. So the way the results are being presented is I'm showing you the weight change every 4 years associated with an increased daily serving of various foods and beverages. And as I said, the average weight gain in these cohorts was about a pound a year, so about 4 pounds every 4 years, although it varied across the 3 cohorts. And so you can put those numbers in context of kind of the average weight gain, which is about 4 pounds every 4 years. And so what we modeled was the weight change associated with increased daily servings of these foods and drinks. On average, the population change was actually 0. Some people increased, some people decreased. And so if you wanted to know the results for a decreased intake of these foods, you could just flip the coefficient the other way, because they were actually about the same, an increase or a decrease. And so we modeled it this way because if it's just calories, right, the hypothesis of this paper was expressly to test the hypothesis that all calories are created equal. Right? If all calories are created equal, then anything we increase in your diet over time, you're going to gain weight. Right? And if you decrease anything in your diet over time, you're going to lose weight. And so these are the bars for the weight gain for the 3 cohorts, and I show all 3 of them to show how remarkably consistent it was across 3 independent cohorts. And you can see some foods are associated with weight gain, some foods are actually kind of neutral, and some foods are associated with weight loss. The more you eat. So this totally diametrically opposes this idea that all calories are the same for long-term weight gain. So that was quite interesting. Another really interesting thing about this paper was we always worry about confounding in observational studies, right? And so if you look at baseline intake of fruits or vegetables, they tend to correlate together. If you look at baseline intake of meats and potatoes, they tend to correlate together. People's diets tend to correlate together in sort of these predictable diet patterns, and of course there's diet pattern analyses. When you look at changes, what's really interesting is individual food items, changes in individual foods are almost totally uncorrelated with each other. So almost all the correlations between these changes were almost 0. So there were very little correlation. The interesting things were there was an inverse correlation between whole fat dairy and low fat dairy. That is interesting. And that was about minus 0.2. So if you have more whole fat dairy, you tend to have less low fat dairy and vice versa because people are replacing. There tended to be a little bit of a positive correlation. I think it was 0.15 between bacon and eggs. So if you increase your bacon, you increase your eggs and vice versa. But those were the strongest correlations actually. Most of them were close to 0. So what does that tell you for the students about the likelihood of confounding amongst these different things? Are they likely to confound each other? They're not, right? They're really unlikely to confound each other. So there's really very little dietary confounding going on here. And these cohorts are relatively well-educated Caucasians, and so there's not confounding by SES, there's not confounding by race. We have physical activity, smoking, TV change. We have almost everything else in the model. There's really not much left that could plausibly be confounders once you start looking at all the models. So what did we find? So we found that the foods associated with the most weight change when you increase their intakes were potatoes. Potato chips were the strongest, but boiled and baked mashed potatoes were also associated with weight gain. Then we found meats and butter, and I'll get back to that. The next 2 we found were sweets and desserts and refined grains. And what I think is really interesting about this is the magnitude of the weight gain was exactly the same. So the magnitude of weight gain for having a cookie or having Skittles was exactly the same as having a bagel or having your favorite, Special K refined breakfast cereal. So, and I think that's metabolically very consistent with the metabolic effects of those foods. There's really not any difference between added sugars or just refined grains or starches. So that was interesting. And then the top beverage was sugar-sweetened beverages. So most of the foods associated with weight gain were poor quality carbohydrates, starches, refined grains, sugars, and liquid sugars. And then there were some foods which were relatively neutral, which is interesting. So, and I'll get back to this later. But cheese was relatively neutral. Low-fat milk and skim milk were relatively neutral. And as you would expect, this was not statistically significant. Diet soda was relatively neutral. It doesn't have any calories, so not a big effect on weight loss or weight gain, which leads you to be confident more confident that the analysis is correct. And then what was most interesting to me was that there were 5 food groups associated with weight loss. So the more you eat, the less weight you gain. Vegetables, nuts, whole grains, fruits, and yogurt. And yogurt was actually the big surprise, not anything any of us had hypothesized. We had hypothesized that slowly digesting, high fiber, minimally processed foods like vegetables, nuts, whole grains, and fruits would lead to less weight gain over time, that you should load up on those things to prevent weight gain. But yogurt was a real surprise, and we'll get back to that, and it was consistently seen in all the cohorts. So, when this was published, it got some press attention, and people called it sort of the, one of the things called it the soda and fries study or something. It said if you eat more soda and eat more fries, you have weight gain, I think that's not very interesting, right? That's not really the interesting finding for me. That sort of makes sense. I think what's really interesting, and it's, I think, really actually to me a profound result compared to the classical theory of calories in, calories out, is if you eat more of some things, you gain less weight, right? That's totally opposite the idea that we should have calorie labels on the menu, or that we should be looking at the calorie label on a package of foods, right? Because it doesn't tell you useful information. If you eat more of some calories and you gain less weight, and you eat more of other calories and you gain more weight, and you eat more of some other calories and your weight doesn't change, right? Is it meaningful? That calories aren't actually meaningful unless you know the direction, and so you're trying to load up on some or others. So I think these findings in 3 cohorts, challenge this notion pretty directly that there's something to be learned about obesogenicy of foods based on their calorie content. So what's going on here? So again, I don't think humans are violating laws of thermodynamics, and so what we proposed is that these foods have very different effects on the compensation, right? The compensation is subtle. It's going on all the time, day after day, week after week, month after month. Your body is trying to maintain its weight homeostasis. And when you eat some foods, you don't compensate as well. So if you eat refined, rapidly digestible carbs and sugars in particular, your body doesn't compensate for those extra calories. It doesn't notice over the course of a month or over the course of the year quite as well, and so you gain weight over time. Whereas if you eat these minimally processed, slowly digestible foods, your body compensates better, and you actually eat a little bit less over a month or over a year over time. And so that's what we proposed, and I think there's a lot of evidence that those things are true, but there's even more interesting mechanisms, which I'll show you later, in particular for yogurt, which didn't fit that paradigm for us. The other thing to emphasize is, as I said, we also looked at physical activity, and this is looking at the quintiles of dietary change. And so if you put all the foods together and kind of create a change score, this is the quintiles of dietary change. And you can see just the quintiles of dietary change pretty much explain the average weight gain in the cohort, about 4 pounds a year, from the best change to the worst change. So you can pretty much explain it. But what's really crucial is that we found that physical activity change was also associated with weight change. And so the highest quintile of physical activity change, but not baseline physical activity. You have to change something to change your weight. The highest quintile of physical activity was associated with less weight gain, and the lowest quintile was associated with the most weight gain. These are totally independent of each other. Okay, so for all your friends outside nutrition who say, well, I exercise so I can eat whatever I want, right? I don't think the data support that at all. They're totally independent effects. And so you really have to worry about both your diet and your physical activity. And the converse is also true, right? If you don't exercise at all and you try to eat well, you're at a disadvantage compared to doing both. So I think that's an important point for us in nutrition to remember. So you remember that most of the foods associated with weight gain were starches, grains, and sugars. So that leads you to think, well, what's the final common unifying pathway? Well, one thing could be glycemic load or glycemic index. And so one of my postdoctoral fellows, Jessica Smith, has looked at this, and this has, I think, been submitted now actually, looking at change in glycemic load and change in glycemic index. And the 50 units and 5 units is, I think, about the difference from the top to the bottom quintile in these studies. And so these are weight changes. These are not relative risks. So 0.9 does not mean good. These are weight changes over 4 years, so they're all positive. And so what you can see is, if glycemic load is increased, weight increased, and if glycemic load is decreased, you could flip the number, weight is decreased. And so the pooled effect was about 1 pound a year for every 50 units of glycemic load, and about 0.8 pounds every 4 years for every 5 units in glycemic index. So both glycemic load and glycemic index do seem to be associated with weight gain. And so maybe the unifier of all the poor quality carbohydrates is their glycemic load or glycemic index. But I think this is where we're sort of stuck in nutrition a little bit, is defining carbohydrate quality. To me, especially for obesity and diabetes, I think poor quality carbohydrate is the single leading problem in our food supply right now. It's about 50% of our calories are carbohydrate, and of that, about maybe 85 to 90% is poor quality carbohydrates. But how do we define poor quality carbohydrate? Do we define it based on fiber content? Do we define it based on whole grain content? Do we define it based on glycemic response? Do we define it based on food structure? Is it a liquid, like a sugar-sweetened beverage, or is it a solid, like a candy? And I think I don't think there's an easy answer to this, because I think all 4 of these vectors of fiber content, whole grain, glycemic response, and liquid versus solid all seem to be important in well-done experimental studies. So they all seem to be independently relevant. And they can all be manipulated separately. So it's hard. It's hard to know how to define a high-quality carbohydrate well. But I think if it has all of those things, if it has high fiber, it's a whole grain, it has a low glycemic response, and it's a solid, it's good. And if it has low fiber, no whole grain, a high glycemic response, and it's a liquid, it's the worst. And if it's in between, it's probably in between. But this is not, I think, simple yet. And just to give you some examples to make this more clear, think of Cheerios. Cheerios is a really good example. Cheerios is whole grain. It's whole oats. So it has all the fiber of regular oats. It is a whole grain, so it has the germ and the bran. It's a solid, which is good, better for satiety probably than liquid sugars. But it has a pretty high glycemic response because they've taken the oats, they've milled them really finely, they put them in this little hot machine that spits them out like O's, and you put it in milk, it gets soggy pretty fast, right? And so this is not, this is a very quickly digestible oat. Same thing with the instant oatmeal, right? The Quaker instant oatmeal, it's just a little bag, you shake it up, you microwave it for 60 seconds, that gets in your mouth, and within seconds your amylase in your mouth is digesting into glucose, it gets to your stomach, it's digested pretty rapidly. So it has a high glycemic response. Whereas if you take, some, of course, glycemic response is hard to measure perfectly, but if you take steel-cut oats on average, they'll have a slower glycemic response. You have to boil them for 30 minutes or 60 minutes. They'll still have the fiber, still have the whole grain content, still have the liquid versus solid. So I think this is challenging to define simply, and I don't have the answer yet, but I think for students, this is something to figure out in the next five years, is how can we come up with a metric to define carbohydrate quality that's simple, that's actionable for policy, that's biologically relevant. What's interesting is we talk about whole grains a lot, but I actually think of the 4 vectors, the whole grain part of it is actually the least well established. If you have something that has a low glycemic response, is a solid, and has high fiber content, does it really matter that the germ is there? That it's a true whole grain, or does it matter and I don't think we actually know that. So we talk about whole grains, and I believe that there's, at least theory why the germ might be important. But I think really the best evidence still is for the fiber content, the glycemic response, and liquid versus solid. So in the meantime, I think, so let me just give you an example, a better example of how I think this gets confusing to people. If we just focus on sugars, right, that's the new kind of player in town. We've said no more, it's not fat anymore, it's sugars. It's all sugars, or fructose. If you're, my friend Rob Lustig, it's all about fructose, it's all about sugar, it's added sugar is going to be on the label. The AHA came out with, American Heart Association came out with a statement on sugar, the Canadian government came out with a statement on added sugar, the WHO came out with a statement on added sugar. I was a reviewer for all of those documents, and I said the same thing to all of them. They all ignored me. I said that, as fun as this is and as exciting as this is to have this new kid on the block, there's no evidence that added sugar is any different than natural sugar, and there's no evidence that that's any different than just refined grains or starches. And it's bad. I do think it's bad. They're all bad, but why are we picking one thing? We're going to mislead and distract and open room for manipulation. And here's why I'm worried about that, especially solid added sugars. So here's cornflakes. Kashi's good friend, which in full disclosure our family has for breakfast, and Kashi's good friend Cinnaraisin, which is the sweetened version of that. And so if you just looked at the sugars, right, you'd say Kellogg's cornflakes, 2 grams of sugar. This isn't even added, but most of this is added. Kashi Good Friends, 10 grams, and Kashi Good Friends Cinnaraisin, it's a little bit flavored more, it has raisins in it, 13 grams of sugar. So the obvious choice is the cornflakes, right? You'd say, well, look, those have all this sugar in it. But is that really the healthy choice? So my wife actually did a nice paper to compare 5 different metrics for defining whole grain carbs. She looked at the whole grain stamp, which is industry sponsored. She looked at 3 different USDA definitions, which all have to do with looking at the ingredients list. And if you think Americans are confused by the nutrition facts panel, wait till you tell them to start looking in the ingredients list. But those are the 3 USDA recommendations. One is to look for and see if there's a whole grain at the beginning of the ingredients list as the first ingredient. Second is to look for the word whole anywhere in the ingredients list, and of course that doesn't always work because oats don't have the word whole in them. And then third is to look for either of those things and no added sugar. So it's pretty complicated, but she looked at those 3, the whole grain stamp, and this ratio that we proposed for the American Heart Association, which is, this is really complicated, this is hard to figure out. Let's just see if we can do a simple rule that roughly captures the total amount of refined carbohydrate versus fiber. And we came up with this ratio, which was empiric, based on the whole grain content of wheat, basically. And we found that actually it worked better. It worked better than all of the other metrics at identifying whole grains that were lower in calories, higher in fiber, lower in sugars, lower in sodium, lower in trans fat. And so a ratio of greater than 10 to 1, and I'll show you examples, avoid. A ratio of less than 10 to 1 is a good choice. And a ratio of less than 5 to 1 is a great choice. So this very simple ratio actually seems to work right now. If food companies start dumping Metamucil in food, then maybe this won't work anymore. But for right now, actually, it's a pretty good rule. And so to go back to our examples, right? So the first thing that's interesting is, so Kellogg's Corn Flake, the serving size is smaller. So because it's fluffier, so even though it's a cup, it's only 28 grams. So that's a little confusing for people. But if you look at the ratio, right, it has 24 grams of carb, 1 gram of fiber, because it's all refined, right? It's just refined, highly refined corn. And so the ratio is 24 to 1. If you look at Kashi Good Friends, you have 42 grams of fiber, and of carbohydrate, and 12 grams of fiber. So the ratio is actually about 4 to 1, which is really quite good. And if you look at Cinnaraisin, even the one that has raisins and some sweet in it, it's 41 grams of carbohydrate and 8 grams of fiber, so 5 to 1, so pretty good. So try this. Go look at the products that you buy and you choose, and you'll actually find that this works pretty well for breads and energy bars and all of these things. And so this also will lead you to dark chocolate, which is good, because dark chocolate has an amazingly good carb to fiber ratio. So let's go back to the weight change results. I want to talk a little bit about protein. We've talked about carbohydrate. So we found that meats were associated with weight gain, whether they were processed or unprocessed. Butter was associated with weight gain, which sort of, people say, well, butter's fatty. That makes sense. But cheese, which is almost all fat, right? And did people read Michael Moss's Fat, Sugar, and Salt? Has anybody read that book? So he has a whole chapter on cheese and how bad it is for the U.S. food supply, for the U.S. diet and all this. Cheese was not associated at all with weight gain. And if you were worried about confounding, right, cheese should be associated with weight gain, right? Cheese is not, most of it's pizza in the U.S. or cheese on French fries. And so this was not associated with weight gain at all, interestingly. And then low-fat or skim milk or whole-fat milk were also not associated with weight gain. And yogurt was associated with weight loss. Right? So simple nutrient explanations, macronutrient explanations don't fit here, right? This isn't a macronutrient thing. This isn't fat. There's something else going on here. And so what might be going on? Well, we can look at other evidence. And so this is studies that have looked at incident diabetes in prospective cohorts. This is a meta-analysis of total dairy from all sources. And it summed up several prospective cohort studies. And if you look at high versus low dairy intake and incident diabetes, about 13,000 cases in these 6 cohorts, there's a protective association. And since this was a meta-analysis, they couldn't tease out very well which type of dairy it was, because each study reported it differently and categorized it differently. But there seemed to be something protective about dairy for diabetes. And what's most interesting is subsequent to that, a large analysis was published from the EPIC cohorts, which is kind of a meta-analysis in and of itself, because it's from 8 different cohorts across Europe. And just this study had 12,000 cases of incident diabetes, so really a large study. And what they found was milk was pretty neutral, actually, overall for incident diabetes. Whether you had low-fat milk or whole-fat milk, it was pretty neutral. But both yogurt and, interestingly, cheese were associated with lower risk of incident diabetes. And given our weight loss results for yogurt, I think this is really quite interesting. And cheese, of course, is dairy fat, the great demon, right, for weight gain. But here it was associated with less weight gain. So we started looking at this more, and this is unpublished results. Also, Jessica Smith is leading this work. So the first question we asked is, well, what happens if people exchange cheese for yogurt, or exchange cheese for meat, or exchange fish for chicken? Or that's what the U.S. Dietary Guidelines say, right? They say exchange these choices. So we said, okay, what are people doing in practice? What are they exchanging most commonly with? And so the really incredible thing is, remember I told you all the intercorrelations were 0? They were almost totally uncorrelated with each other when we first looked, which was quite, baffling, right? People aren't in practice exchanging fish for steak or chicken over time. They might get one meal, but on average over the course of the year, they don't do that. So what are they mostly exchanging protein sources with? It's mostly being exchanged with carb. So when we looked at total carb, a percentage of calories from carbohydrate, these are correlations. We found almost every processed food almost every protein food its changes were uncorrelated with each other in all 3 cohorts. But in all 3 cohorts, they were inversely correlated with carbs. So if you ate more meat, you ate less carb, and vice versa. If you ate less meat, you ate more carb. pretty much across the board with a few exceptions, and the exceptions are interesting. So the first is legumes. So legumes, of course, have a lot of carb in them. So if you eat more legumes, you'll eat more carb. That's just implicit in the legume. But what are the other exceptions? The other exceptions are all basically what's consumed as low-fat dairy in this country. This is what I mentioned earlier. Low-fat milk, sweetened yogurt, and plain yogurt, which plain yogurt, sweetened yogurt for sure is almost all low-fat in this country. Plain yogurt is a mix. Probably depends, but I still think more people buy low-fat than whole-fat yogurt. I don't have the industry data on that, but I would guess that to be true. So still relatively low-fat, although there's some whole-fat in there. And then low-fat cheese. And what do people do when they have low-fat milk? When they increase their intake of low-fat products, they increase their intake of carbs. So it's exactly what we had sort of hypothesized in 2011, that people compensate all the time. And so if you cut your calories in one place, you actually replace them. What do you replace them with? The background poor quality carbohydrate. So that was quite interesting. And then the second question we asked is, well, is there an interaction actually? Now we want to know, so since people aren't actually interchanging these protein foods with each other, what happens when they interchange them with carb or not? Because some people are and some people aren't. These correlations aren't perfect. So we did an interaction analysis looking at whether if people increase their intake of these protein sources, whether they did it and increased their glycemic load, whether they did it and kept their glycemic load the same, or whether they did it and decreased their glycemic load. So the positive means you're eating them together, like complements, right, on average. The negative means you're changing your protein and not exchanging it for carb. And the negative means you're replacing it, right? You're on average over time, not necessarily at a meal, but on average over time, you're increasing your protein and replacing it with carb. And so what's interesting is, so red meat and processed meat were strongly associated with weight gain, but if you replaced carb, they were actually less associated with weight gain, and this was statistically significant. Chicken, interestingly, was relatively neutral in our overall analysis, but if you ate chicken and lowered your carb, it was actually associated with less weight gain. Fish, which we hadn't looked at before, was protective. You ate more fish, you lost weight, the more fish you ate, which is I wasn't expecting at all, but which is interesting. But again, if you ate fish and replaced carb, you lost more weight than if you ate fish and increased your carb. And then the couple of examples that were the most interesting to me were eggs and cheese, which are often eaten but not always eaten with carbs. So if you ate eggs and increased your carb, you gained weight. But if you ate eggs and reduced your carb, so you ate eggs instead of your breakfast cereal, then you actually lost substantial weight in these cohorts. And this is the pooled results from all three cohorts. They look the same in each cohort. And cheese is also interesting. It was neutral overall, if you remember, in our original analysis, but there's a significant interaction by carb intake. If you eat cheese and crackers, or you eat cheese and bread, or if you eat pizza, you're eating the grain with the cheese, you're gaining a little bit of weight. But if you eat cheese and over time replace your carbs, so if you eat cheese and fruit or cheese and nuts, you're going to actually lose weight. So really, still early, observational, it's from three cohorts. So there's some confidence in the results, but this to me, again, totally blows out of the water this idea that all calories are the same. If it's not only the type of food you eat, but what you eat it with and how you replace it, right? It's much more complicated than just counting calories and saying, well, this is a low-fat baked potato chip, so it's going to be better for me than a whole-fat baked potato chip because there's more calories in one versus the other. What are the mechanisms underlying these things? I think there's really complex influences going on, and I'm going to show you some of this in the last few minutes. I think basically, as I said, we're complex organisms, and so different foods, the way they're processed, the nutrients in them, how they're consumed, influence not only our satiety and our hunger, but our hormonal responses, fat synthesis in the liver, which I think is a really major common pathway for risk of diabetes and visceral adiposity, and that's mostly driven by carbohydrate. Brain reward, the microbiome, I know there's interest here at the center in that. I think that's a huge area of interest, and I think the yogurt really fits in with the microbiome, as I'll show you, and even metabolic expenditure. So just to go through these studies quickly, I'm running out of time. This is one study which they purposefully tried to get equal weight loss, and they wanted to look what was happening with hepatic fat. And so they put people in a well-controlled study on calorie-controlled diets, low-calorie versus low-carb. So just any low-calorie versus low-carb. And they got similar 5% weight loss, which was by design. So they got the exact same weight loss. But when they looked at the hepatic fat, they saw nearly a twofold greater reduction in hepatic fat in just a 2-week trial. And so, again, clear evidence that calorie for calorie foods are very different. Diet quality strongly influences metabolism, in this case hepatic fat. This is an observational study looking at dietary fats and weight gain. total fat, saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat are all pretty neutral for weight gain. Trans fat, interestingly, sort of jumped out, and this was actually published in 2003. Another study in women was published. Different cohort, looked very similar. Most fats are kind of neutral for weight gain, but trans fat kind of jumped off the chart. And then after that, a really nice randomized trial was published in non-human primates, where they actually calorie controlled the primates because they didn't want them to gain weight, and gave one 8% trans fat and one cis trans fat. And they actually, even though they were calorie matching them for their age and their observed physical activity, the monkeys fed the trans fat gained more weight, even though they were calorie matched. And when they did imaging, this was all abdominal visceral fat, not subcutaneous fat. Again, consistent with this idea that trans fats activate de novo lipogenesis. And that's been seen in many animal experiments now, that trans fat activate the genes for hepatic de novo lipogenesis independently of their calories. And we've just looked at trans fat blood levels, a biomarker of trans fat, and incident diabetes. And the two major trans fats in partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, especially 18-1, were positively associated with incident diabetes, again, consistent with something going on with trans fat and metabolic risk. This is a really nice trial looking at calorie-controlled test meals. They had equal calories, they had equal macronutrients, equal sweetness, equal palatability. The only difference was the glycemic index, and so the people couldn't tell them apart. And what they showed is that this area in the brain, which is sort of called the food addiction center, lit up much more when people had the high glycemic foods. Now this has been done before, comparing like chocolate cake to asparagus, right? People have written about this, but that's not really a fair comparison, right? So what's really interesting about this is they isolated it to just the glycemic index. So the people couldn't tell any difference between the shakes or the meals. They had no pre-specified notion that they were going to enjoy one or not the other. They tasted the same. And so glycemic index alone, matched for calories, activates brain reward. This is several follow-up studies have been looked now in animal experiments at yogurt, and I don't know if anybody at the HNRCA is doing this, but I think this is a really interesting area to look at yogurt and the microbiome. And so this is one of those studies. They fed mice either control chow diets or fast food diets and looked at weight gain, and then they added yogurt, probiotic yogurt, to the diets. And what they found is if you look at the body weight, whether on a control diet or on a fast food diet, a Western fast food diet, the mice gained less weight when they were given probiotic yogurt. And then when they gave them purified Lactobacillus reuteri in water, they saw the exact same effects, no different from giving the yogurt. And when they looked at total calories, they were actually consuming the same calories, even though they were gaining less weight. And there was no change in the composition of their microbiome, but there was changes in the function of the microbiome. And so eating the Lactobacillus reuteri triggered changes in the immune system, and through knockout models, this was dependent on CD4 cells and interleukin-10. So again, calorie controlled and consistent with the yogurt results I showed you. And then, again, in the interest of time, I'll go quickly, but this is a very nice trial. If you're interested, look at the reference. This is the trial that diet quality, diet composition actually alters energy out. And so people who were put on weight loss diets, their weight was stabilized. This was their total energy expenditure at baseline. On a low-fat diet, their metabolic expenditure measured by doubly labeled water dropped about 400 calories. This is kind of called the weight thermostat. This has been seen by many other studies before. If you lose weight and you get it on a weight-stable diet, your metabolic rate goes down. People feel cold, they feel tired, and they start gaining weight again on a low-fat diet. On a low glycemic diet, a considerable less decline in metabolic expenditure by doubly labeled water. And on the high-fat diet, almost no decline in energy expenditure. They had accelerometers on them. There was no change in physical activity. This is an inherent effect of the diet quality, of the diet composition on their metabolic expenditure, which is really interesting, which explains why a lot of people have trouble on low-fat diets keeping the weight off. So again, there's these very complex influences. And so this idea that we can just count calories or count single nutrients and think that these things are healthier because they're low-fat or turkey sausage links or fat-free salad dressing or all of these things which are inundating our food system and our policies, I think is really misleading. And this is the NIH recommendations I mentioned. I'll just maybe end on these in the interest of time. I showed these, I think, at at the talk I gave at the Friedman School as well. This just really, I think, gives a clear example of why this can take you down the wrong road. These are go foods, slow foods, and woe foods. This is recommendations on the NHLBI website for what kids and families should do for healthy diets. Go foods mean eat them almost any time, they're fine, knock yourself out. Slow foods, be careful. Woe foods are once in a while, it's a special treat. So on the go list are trimmed beef and pork. So as long as you just cut the fat off, knock yourself out, eat all the beef and pork you want. Fat-free creamy salad dressing, fat-free mayonnaise, and diet soda. And I actually had to go look up. I had to go to the store to find out what's in fat-free salad dressing, right? Because salad dressing should be oil. By definition, salad dressing should be oil. And I said, what is in fat-free salad dressing? So it's just starch, sugar, and salt. And so the NIH is telling kids to go have starch, sugar, and salt on their salads because it's lower calories. And then in the slow foods, the ones that you should be careful of, and you should go to those other choices, all vegetables with added fat, no qualifiers whatsoever, avocados, tuna can and oil, soybean oil and olive oil, which tuna or cannon are very healthy, peanut butter and nuts, strongly associated with less weight gain and metabolic benefits. Vegetable oil, olive oils are in the same category as oven-baked French fries, ginger snaps, pretzels, and sports drinks. And the woe foods, be really, really careful, whole eggs cooked with fat or whole milk are in the same category as cookies and cakes and regular soda. So this is, I think, what happens when we go down this road of all calories being the same. You start to lead, I think, to recommendations which aren't probably the right ones for consumers. And of course, industry loves this. I just, I've said the major conclusions. I think diet quality is crucial. And what's really nice is this brings together cardiovascular health with metabolic health and obesity. It's the same actually set of diet priorities. And it didn't have to be that way. It would have been really bad if it wasn't that way. But fortunately, it does seem it's the same set of priorities. All calories are not created equal. We should not be telling people to eat less, but to eat better. In terms of what eating better means, I think we should talk about foods and overall diet patterns. We need to increase minimally processed foods and reduce refined grain starches and sugars, and especially emphasize the good. People are worried about gaining weight. Tell them to eat more of healthy things. That's easier to do than to cut out things that they might like to eat. And these conventional emphases about total calories or fat content or energy density or added sugars or everything in moderation, just kind of have everything you want, I think are actually misleading. And the final thing, those changes I showed you were pretty small. Those were small changes, 1 serving a day of this or 1 serving per day of that. Together, they actually make a big difference in the long term. They really beneficially influence our ability to compensate. And so actually that gives us an amazing tool. It's a very optimistic outlook that these small changes can make a big difference in the population in the long run. So I'd just like to acknowledge my research team and collaborating faculty, and thank you very much. Yeah.
Which study?
The Johnson JAMA study.
The meta-analysis.
Yeah. We're just about to submit a letter to JAMA on that. It included a really strange collection of studies which it shouldn't have included because there wasn't the same diets across in every cell and every study. So for example, it included bariatric patients, it included studies that provided food, along with the behavioral studies. If you get rid of the stuff that shouldn't be there, there was actually no difference in weight loss between the moderate and the low. The low carb diets did not have a benefit for weight loss at 6 or 12 months, and in fact the dropout rate was higher. So, I would urge us all to have a very serious look at the quality of this research, as a means perhaps for trying to make progress.
Yeah, so the comment was there's very varied quality of the research. And I think this is such a new field. This is really such a new area to think about diet beyond just calories. I mean, I apologize if there's somebody in the room that's been doing it for 20 years and I'm overgeneralizing, but across all of science, I think this is not what many people have been thinking about. And so I think that there's still a lot of old ideas and new ideas being mixed together, and our job at Friedman and the Center is to help make that clear to the scientists and policymakers.
Yeah,
so I have no truck with the fact that all calories are not equal, especially metabolically, at least thermodynamically, maybe they're not metabolically. But we have a very limited amount of time in the limelight of the press. We have very limited amount of resources to devote to research in general. And I'm wondering about the emphasis that you're putting specifically on focusing about not all calories are equal. in preference, say, to talking about why are we taking in the calories in the first place. And what I'm getting at is people who don't have a lot of access to cheap food don't gain that much weight. You know, people who don't have a lot of food, they don't gain those extra 20 pounds over the 20 years. And I'm wondering, what's the proper mix? What do you think is the proper mix of focusing on just good old time self-control? And saying, look, you're only going to gain 1 pound per year. This is the amount of ounces it is per day. If you cut out those 6 almonds or that 1 cookie per day, and focus on that as a major program, you know, would you really achieve the same objectives even without knowing mechanism?
Yeah, so I think categorically we wouldn't, and I think that we have empiric evidence that we wouldn't, because that's what we've been trying to do for decades, is tell people that. And I don't think our willpower has changed in 30 or 40 years. We're the same people we were before. And so the food, something has changed in the environment to cause the obesity epidemic. So I think telling people to cut out almonds is the wrong thing to do. The population, on a population level, will gain weight if we tell people to do that. So I think that that it's not a question of self-control. I think it's a question of very subtle mechanistic things that are going on because of changes in our food system, changes in marketing, changes in TV watching, changes in sleep duration, changes in the microbiome possibly. And all of those things are not in our control. And so I think it's an illusion of self-control. You know, again, the population is this, we're the same people we were in the 70s, and we didn't have an obesity epidemic in the 70s. So it really came on after 1980. So for some people it might work very well, right? There are people that respond to that. But I think population-wide, we've been trying for, you know, decades, and we haven't really made much of a dent. Although, because of the food environment changing, things are starting to get better. So I think this is exactly the conversation we need to figure out. You know, I'm moving that that's not the right approach, but maybe, you know, maybe it is. And so I think this is where we need to. As I said, we figured out 25% of it. So it's an important conversation to continue to have. Yeah.
So obviously, I think this is a controversial issue, and I think it would be really useful for us to have actually maybe a panel discussion at either at a HNRCA seminar or at a frequent seminar where we could get a group of people together from frequent and HNRCA, and we have a discussion about that. I think that would be quite useful because obviously there's a lot to be still learned about that, and there are opposing views, not opposing views, but different views and a spectrum of views on this topic, which I think would be great for students and everybody else to sort of hear all of the different views. But with that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Mozaffarian.